My guest today is Martin Gurri, president of Fifth Wave Analytics and former analyst at the U.S. government's Open Source Center, part of the CIA. Martin is the author of the book, The Revolt of the Republic and the Crisis of Authority in the New Millennium, which is the subject of today's conversation. Martin, welcome to the show.
Thank you, David. Happy to be here in scenic Lower Manhattan.
Before this book, you co-authored an essay called Our Visual Persuasion Gap, discussing the power of visual information. In light of that essay, I'm wondering what you think about Twitter. So you wrote that essay before really Twitter got big.
Yes.
And Twitter being mostly a written medium, there are images there, but actually it's much more about conveying thoughts with words. So does Twitter, in some way, in your mind, rehabilitate the written word as an effective medium for communication?
I don't think so. My take is that it's pretty clear that what we call digital media really means the triumph of the image over the printed word.
Okay.
And when you look at social media, it's doubly so. The two big thumping giants of social media are YouTube video and Facebook, which is the greatest repository of still and moving images in the history of the human race.
Yeah.
And you take a big dip down below, and you have Instagram, and then you have LinkedIn, which is specialized. And you get a big dip down below that, and you reach Twitter. And that's both in actual numbers of users and time spent on site. Now, I think what happens with Twitter, and I had seen your question, I was thinking about it, is every politician and his attack dogs, or her attack dogs, are on Twitter. Every journalist.
Overrepresented.
Every journalist
Sure.
is on Twitter. So there is a kind of sense that Twitter sets the agenda.
Yeah.
Because the politicians say something on it, and then everybody either praises or condemns, yells and rants. And then the journalists write about it and they put it there. But that's very disproportionate to its actual, I think, influence within social life, American social life, or global social life. I think all the other social media networks are far more popular.
Yeah, they are. And yet I agree that the reason why I asked the question was it feels to me like Twitter is more globally impactful. And one of the ways I would characterize the distinction between, let's say, the Facebook and LinkedIn and then Twitter is that the former ones are much more private and small in the sense of how people use them. So it must be much more, I suppose, intimate. So it's like an aggregation of a lot of little things to preview a part of our conversation.
Yes.
And Twitter is much more about larger scale movement, let's say. Would you agree with that characterization?
Nope.
Okay.
I think, I don't know, there's a pretty amazing video from Brazil following the election of Jair Bolsonaro there, a populist, a man who makes Donald Trump sound like an etiquette book, okay, about
Sure.
the things that he says. And these look to be, in the video, fairly humble people. They're all Bolsonaro fans, and in heavily accented with Portuguese sounds, they're saying WhatsApp, Facebook.
Right.
They feel like those two platforms helped them win the election. They didn't mention Twitter.
Mm-hmm. Right. So what's with Twitter here then? Is it just different here in the United States, or is
It is primarily one of the differences between Facebook, YouTube. Now, WhatsApp, for historic reasons, has a big presence in Brazil. I don't really know, honestly, how widespread it is in the world. But a big difference between YouTube and Facebook on one side and Twitter on the other is YouTube and Facebook are global. They are global and have been practically from the beginning. Twitter is an American thing, yeah.
And they're, I would say, I mean, I don't know, do you think that's the case that they're much more, call it image friendly or image based or image focused than Twitter?
Well, I just gave you that example of that. No, I actually think the images are all YouTube and Facebook.
Yeah.
And that video, a short little video on Facebook of these Bolsonaro fans shouting Facebook, WhatsApp. The humor to an American is they don't come close to pronouncing the words correctly.
Yeah, sure.
But it's very sincere and a very powerful statement. I would challenge any number of words that you can put down that are as persuasive as just looking at that little set of images for a few seconds.
One of the things, so I'm in the media business, I suppose, here on the podcast, right? One of the things that I definitely appeals to me, the idea of the richer the media, right? So that being audio is better than the written word. I prefer the podcast to the written essay. I don't like it. There's more information. You can hear the voice, and you can imagine how they're saying it, and that matters, right?
Yes.
And then video, yet more powerful again.
Yes.
Challenge that I've found, though, is that video is way harder to produce. It's harder. I think that maybe, and again, see what you think about this. So here's my thesis for what then the barrier to video is that in order to get that right video image, there's so much information there's a lot more scope for it going wrong and having just a little bit be off, right? Think of like if we were to record this as a video conversation, we need a lot of lighting, right? To make it not look kind of ridiculous, and the technology seems to me to be not quite there to make video as easy to produce as, let's say, an audio medium, and then that much harder again still than just writing a tweet.
Yeah, it's even worse than that. I was the government lead in basically developing an analytic process for visuals.
Right. Okay.
Visual persuasion. Right. There's so many aspects to visuals and images. This was just persuasiveness, and one of the things that's very striking is even if you get everything right, all those details, the technical details you're talking about that are so hard to get right, the effects may be totally unintended. If you make yourself look to be an important person and come up and wear a $1,000 suit with a Italian silk tie, and your voice is very trained, and the lighting is perfect on you, and you have a chiseled face, you may come across, in fact, you almost certainly will come across as very inauthentic and unpersuasive.
Amazing. Yeah. There's too much information there. People can interpret it in whatever way they like.
I think the trouble with visuals is it's an entirely different proposition from text. In text, we have all of us have a rhetorical framework that we acquire in grade school, and if we go to college, we learn to apply it ourselves. To write rhetorically.
Rewrite, refine. You get the message.
Right. Visuals bypass that.
Yeah.
The visuals go straight to our reptile brain.
Yeah.
And our reptile brain interprets things very differently than our frontal cortex. I mean, it just sometimes looks at what you think you are communicating and bypasses that and sees an entirely different thing. So it's not an easy subject. And even if you get the technical minutia down, you may fail in your communication.
Mm-hmm. So is it possible to control it at all? Like, is there there are news programs who have existed for a long period of time, and they try and contain a particular message and I think that one of the implicit, readings of your book is maybe that worked pretty well for its intended purpose, delivering a very specific message in a very specific way. That was a visual medium, so you had this very rich information channel, but they seem to be able to constrain it or at least direct it to their purpose, that being the news broadcasting channels. Do you agree with that?
At a certain time, yes.
Yeah.
At a certain time, that was definitely the case. I think obviously that time is long gone.
Mm-hmm. Well, how about this? So they still try, and they probably still do the same job they did before, but now there's much more around them.
Right. But to say much more is almost like to say they have become a grain of sand on an endless beach. All right. Yeah. So there's so much more that they are practically, I won't say irrelevant, because things do happen sometimes in the news that have an impact, but they're almost irrelevant. Mm-hmm. Basically, I look to what I call the information sphere, as I mentioned in the book, which includes formal communication platforms like network news and cable news and newspapers, but also includes digital media of all kinds. And the division is kind of interesting analytically, but in the end, information is information. It doesn't really matter where you pick it up. Mm-hmm. It could be on a bizarre little blog somewhere, or it could be some straight-up anchor person talking strangely on CBS News, some descendant of Walter Cronkite. It doesn't really matter if it's going to hit your persuasive spot. it's going to do it.
Mm-hmm. And the key idea in your book is that there is a surprising, well, maybe not surprising in retrospect, but when you were writing it must have been a pretty surprising consequence of this, the whole beach, as opposed to the grain of sand. What is that?
Let me answer that with a story. Once upon a time, I was an employee of CIA. I had what was probably considered at the time the least glamorous place and turned out to be the most consequential.
Yeah.
I was an analyst of global media. And when I started out, it was a fairly straightforward job. Every country had some equivalent of the New York Times. The information streams were minute, tiny little information streams emanating out of even the biggest and most developed countries. And each country had one big agenda-setting source, like the New York Times. And if you go to France, it would be Le Monde and so forth. And so if you wanted to find out what the media was saying, if a president wanted to, if they asked, what are the French saying about my initiative in Europe? You went to Le Monde and you could tell, but that was slightly left. There was another slightly right. Figaro, you took those two newspapers, you covered the entire scope of the question. At a certain moment, first in the 90s with TV, but really when you look at the data, it's with the OOs and the digital revolution.
Data being the amount of
information, just
created,
information
stored,
bits,
exabytes, whatever those crazy words are. Yeah.
Yes, exactly right. I think exabytes is what they're measured in. Yes, at a certain moment, the amount of information just started exploding, I guess is a word that gets used. It doesn't convey the sense of it. I call it a tsunami. It was an earthquake. It was a civilizational earthquake. And what those of us who were sitting in our cozy corner of CIA noticed was this information tsunami was sweeping over the world, and behind it you could see incredible social and political turbulence. Incredible. And we were pointing to that.
Those were the messages being stored in that information, you mean?
Well, I think that
or implied.
At the end of thinking about it for a while, I basically concluded, and some of the people I was with at the time agreed, was that being authoritative, like all those newspapers I was talking about, like the New York Times, means you have a kind of a little monopoly of information in an environment that is information scarce.
Yep.
So you have it. So when you talk, people listen because what else? There's nothing else. What happens to those authoritative, and it's not just media institutions, but all institutions, government, of course, being the chief one. What happens to those institutions that had little monopolies of information when this tsunami swept over them is that they basically got battered and stripped naked. And then the public, which was creating the information, most of this information, as unlike before, which was institutional and top down, this information was rising up from the public. People were on blogs, people were on Facebook, people were communicating in many different ways, including what we talked about earlier, the visuals. The public took a look at these institutions, now stripped of their aura because they no longer had the semi-monopoly, and something happened there where these institutions lost their authority, and the public perceived them as failed because every mistake they made now was obvious, and they could hammer on it, and they could all yell with each other and say, look, they failed here. If it was Iraq or if it was the stimulus. This is, by the way, not a partisan or ideological thing. It is absolutely both ways. There is a left manifestation of the revolt of the public, and there's a right manifestation. But when you look at both, they have a lot in common. And what they have in common is they have lost the sense that these institutions have any real authority. They feel like they are run by these people that I call the elites. I mean, that word I used that in the book, which was originally published in 2014, and at the time nobody was using that word. So now you have to clarify what I meant by it, because everybody's using that word. I mean by that primarily the people who run these great institutions that essentially make modern society go the way that it does, and their supporters, which are many. So, but the public, which before was really kind of a silent audience, all you could do was listen, and in the end, all you could do was either vote one side of the elites or another side of the elites, is having none of it. And this is not just an American issue. The 2016, of course, and Brexit in Britain, and
you could say America was late to it, really.
America was late to it. That's actually correct. It's funny to look back on this whole concept, because those of us who were in CIA kept pointing to it and saying something has got to happen. This is
Something's going to happen here.
Oh no, something's going to happen there.
Right.
At that time, it was the beginning of this. You could just see the way,
color revolutions.
Yeah, and people. The answer we got, and this, by the way, continued pretty much until the year 2011, was two things. The one was a guy with a gun is going to shut a guy with a laptop 10 times out of 10. All right. So this is all people talking on the internet. And yes, they're very outraged. Interesting that so many people in the Arab world are outraged and are now voicing it. But what does that matter? The dictators still have the guns. That was the one thing you got. Mm-hmm. The second thing you got was a Malcolm Gladwell idea of crowds of people who have met online and never know each other are never going to do the personal sacrificing, the putting their lives on the line that truly committed radicals who have known each other from some sort of structured way, some sort of radical group, have done traditionally. I mean, a radical to a guy like Malcolm Gladwell is a professional. The people that we were talking about, the public, were just people. They were amateurs, all right? So it was very difficult to persuade anybody that this really had any powerful impact. People like Clay Shirky, I mean, he really saw it coming and said, there are bound to be enormous and unpredictable political and social consequences for this. It almost could not fail. And in the year 2011, which I called in the book the year of phase change being, of course, when almost without any noticing, very, very cold water suddenly hardens into ice. And it's the same stuff, but it's very different. And so we had the same kind of yelling and screaming online, but in the year 2011, it crossed the line.
Maybe it's good spot to interject and introduce a bit of some definitions.
Yes.
And you define a few terms in the book, yes. And two of them which are I think interesting and important, certainly in the context the comments made there, were public and crowd. Mm-hmm. If you don't mind maybe telling us what those are and where those come from, definitions.
The public, that's a really good question, and it's a lot harder than you might think to go with an apt definition. As you notice in the book, I spent a lot of time explaining what the public was not, sort of defining it by negatives. It's not the people, for example, although every revolt that you see where the public is involved, like in the Arab Spring or the occupiers, they claim to be the 99%, or they claim to be the Egyptian people. They claim to be, but they're not. They are not the masses. That's a very 20th century term that connotes that there's some mass movement that is controlled from on high. This is a very uncontrolled movement. When these things cross over into the streets, into street protests, they tend to be very non-organized, if not disorganized. And the crowd, of course, that's the hardest one. The crowd and the public. The way I think I put it in the book is, if you were to talk about them in terms of a Facebook relationship, you would say it's complicated. The public is not the crowd, but it has an intimate relationship with the crowd in the streets, which is usually voicing principles and ideals that the public has manifested in its opinions. All right. And today, thanks to digital devices, there can be a one-to-one communication between a crowd in the street and a public that's diffusing this throughout the information sphere. So those are different. Now, in the end, I don't have my definition in front of me. I wish I did, but I went with Walter Whitman's definition of the public. Mm-hmm. Walter Whitman, one of the smartest men of the 20th century, although he was wrong about many things. He has a couple of books dwelling on the public and what it is and what it should be. And he came to the conclusion, very sad for him, because he was one of the people who thought the public and the citizens should be the same thing, or the public and the people ought to be the same thing. And he came to the decision that they were not. The public are just the people who are interested in an affair, is the way he puts it, if I remember correctly, and are able to influence the actors for or against. That was a 1920s definition. Today, of course, one of the big theses, the main thesis of my book is that the public has become one of the most powerful actors themselves on the political stage. But the definition holds. And I think what that means is that there isn't just one public. There are many. Mm-hmm. Like I said before, it could be right or left. It could be the Bernie Sanders public was not the Donald Trump public.
Nor was it Hillary Clinton public. And so there's another interesting idea that I was thinking about quite a lot was the public it manifests itself by, I think the word niche interests was used there, right?
Yes.
So people have, you can be part of many publics yourself.
Yes.
And those publics are for the most part passive. So they don't act so much typically, and they're defined by their little world that they like to create for themselves and live in it.
Yeah, I mean, passive. I think there's a lot of activity that goes on because of those niche interests. I think that was the original impact of that digital tsunami was to take the mass audience, which was completely a fiction of the industrial age, and break it up into the things that audience was really and truly interested in. And of course, if you are the New York Times and you were the kingpin of the industrial age in terms of information, you said, well, politics is important and what the president says is important and, events in Europe might be important. Honestly, the public, what you see that happened online is cute kittens suddenly takes over the internet and pornography takes over the internet. Okay, so you have the public, it has very many strange tastes that are not those of the elites or the elites wish to discuss. But also, for example, there was a incredibly interesting economist, blogosphere. Places like Iraq developed very advanced blogospheres where people would talk about things like feminism. So these little niche constellations were the first step to where we are today, which is, I think, way beyond that in terms that a lot of these groups are almost hyperactive. They're not only not passive, they're hyperactive. They're looking for sources of outrage so they can get themselves jacked up and go shout at somebody.
I want to come back to Lippmann for a second, because in his perspective, I think he had and I didn't read the original book, but I read some of his other work, and The Phantom Public being the book that he wrote there. Uh-huh. And his perspective on the problem that he was identifying, a little bit different than yours. Do you remember his kind of concern about the public at the time? It was the disempowerment of the elites, I think it was. Was that right?
His concern was that the public, which he identified with the citizenry,
right,
was sovereign. That was the theory of liberal democracy. It was sovereign. In the end, they elected our rulers, and their opinion guided them. The public opinion guided them. That public opinion you may have read. I mean, that's probably his best book. And this was kind of a follow-on to that one. He was a complete top-down elite guy. I mean, he was probably at the beginning of the progressive wave where he thought experts should take over the government.
Insider, a term he used as like a compliment.
No, it was like the only person that counted was the insider.
Yeah, amazing.
And of course the public were the vast majority of, I mean, I won't say he called them deplorables, but it was a little bit of you could see that the Walter Lippmann, he was a brilliant man and, knew many languages and so you could see his lip kind of curling when he talked about the public a little bit. And he was a little bit in despair because he did believe in democracy somewhat. And he came to the conclusion that the public and the people were not the same, and that the public only got engaged in a very ill-informed way and stampeded in kind of these cascades of public opinion in one direction or another, either by a manipulative media or by manipulative politicians.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of similar themes to what you write about and are concerned about. Now, Walter was in what I think we would call the third wave or fourth wave. Maybe you can define what the waves are and tell me where you think he sat.
Oh, I love to talk about that. Yes. When I started researching information, because this idea that information has it's more than something you learn from. Information has effects. Information has power. It can strip an institution naked. That was very puzzling to me. So I actually researched the history of information, which is a harder thing to do than you might think. It's not a subject that people engage in often.
Ironic.
But I came in, every category like this, every historical categorization is up for grabs. But this one satisfied my purposes. Information spreads not in I would say gradual manner, but in pulses, in waves, I called it. And the first pulse I saw that was remarkable was, of course, the invention of writing. And you see the effect that leads to a class of society that is pretty much ruled by a Mandarin or priestly group, right, that can decipher these very complex writings that they had. The second wave is the alphabet. And the alphabet massively simplifies that. And now you have literate populations of citizens. You could not have had the classical republics of Greece and Rome without the alphabet. Not to say that the alphabet created Athens, Periclean Athens, but it would have been an impossibility without people being able to read or write. And that couldn't have been done with hieroglyphs, for example. The third one, and possibly the most powerful, is the printing press, and I'm not even going to dwell on that much. That's pretty obvious. The fourth, which is where our friend Walt Whitman was sitting, was mass media. It was essentially a democratization, although it doesn't feel that way today, of information by commercializing it. It was the industrial model of information. So you went from having gentlemen who read these, they called them newspapers or magazines, but it was meant for a handful of gentlemen who knew each other and who also often corresponded in letters and often had them printed in newspapers as almost literary devices, to millions of people reading the newspaper, and the newspaper being an industry that makes a lot of money. That had the effect of putting those millions of people, that they were an audience at that point, I call them, within the same informational framework, which it had never been before. Before, the gentleman knew, and you didn't. Now, pretty much everybody knows what the newspaper knows, okay? But it was very top-down. It was very industrial. It was very arbitrary. What is news? I mean, ask yourself, what is news? We grappled with that. I actually think there was a moment in the life of the American Congress where they were trying to protect journalists from having to reveal their sources to prosecutors, for example. And they wanted to somehow create some legal protections for journalism. But the problem was they couldn't come up with a definition of what a journalist was. All right? So the idea of just somebody working for a newspaper as a journalist is about as close as you're going to get. Whatever gets produced by the news business is news. And it can be a runaway bride or it could be a war. It's either one of those things. Read also Walter Lippmann on news. He's very ferocious about that. But that was a very top-down system, very controlling system, very easy, for example, although the model was invented in what might be the democratic countries, but it's very easy to take that model and turn it into, for example, what was happening in the Soviet Union, where the party pretty much dictated every word that was printed in every newspaper or every word that was said on television news. It was very easy to control. It was the industrial system, which is the way our institutions are organized, top down, very hierarchical, very unyielding. It's not, even in the democracies, a democratic organization. It's very authority driven.
Well, one of the things that interested me, I researched some of ancient Greece recently for actually a podcast, and I noticed that what they called democracy then was really ruled by the elite, actually.
Yes.
So it was democracy for those who were citizens, and that was something like, I don't know, a quarter of the male population. And so democracy has meant different things, perhaps as these waves have crested.
Yeah, but the Athenians, they were smart, because what they had was this institution called ostracism. And the point of ostracism was anybody who you thought was getting too big for his britches and had to be an elite. You just put your little chip with his name on a pot, and if you go to the museums in Athens, they still have those. And if you got enough votes of that not so good kind, you were supposed to go into exile, I think, for 5 or 10 years.
Like, say, Socrates, most famous example of that?
Well, he wasn't ostracized. He was actually executed, and that was a different case.
I thought he committed suicide after being ostracized. He wouldn't handle it. Okay.
No. He was executed for, I think, an entirely different thing. No. And the ostracism ended when it was manipulated to basically get somebody exiled who was not an elite. And after that, everybody said, well, that's not the point of this, and they didn't have any more. So, yes. So to conclude my waves, the fifth wave is, of course, this tsunami. And I want to dwell on that just a little bit longer. I know that I've talked about it a bit already, but the information, it pulses. But if you look at the overall line for it, although obviously it grew with the printing press and it grew for the mass media, it was the people who have charted this. It was a fairly steady and stately growth. All right. If you look at what happened at the beginning of the OOs, it's just startling. I mean, the data on it. Somebody measured the amount of information produced in the year 2002, and it had doubled the amount produced in the entire previous history. All right, from the cavemen times to now. Somebody measured 2003, and it had doubled 2002. That trend has pretty much continued to the present day. You chart that, and I think there's a chart, and there is a chart following that process in my book, and it really does look like a tsunami. It's a stupendous wave, this enormous thing that goes all of a sudden spikes up and keeps going higher and higher and higher. So that's the fifth wave. The fifth wave is unprecedented in human history, honestly.
So probably in each of these waves, though, somebody will have said something similar, and Lipman did himself in the last wave, which is to say, this information, there's too much getting out there, what's going to happen when the public gets empowered, what's going to overthrow all the institutions we know and care about. But they've persisted, and you're saying it's going to happen this time. So tell me a little bit about kind of why they might be wrong and why now might be a more dire time. Not that you're necessarily predicting that it's going to happen now, but...
You're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that's very fun to read is the reaction to the printing press and printed books.
Yep.
And what everybody said was, by everybody, I mean those who have been used to having books because they could afford very expensive handwritten manuscript books, they said things like, but this is all pornography.
Well, a lot of it probably was.
This is all fake news. You know, this is stuff being, people who are not experts are publishing books on areas that they're not expert in. This should never be allowed to happen. Yes, it had always happened. And once the information is out of the cat is out of the bag, you're not going to put it back in. I'm not saying that the situation today is more dire than before. And I have been called a dark prophet. I've been called a techno-pessimist. I've got all kinds of names. And I rise indignantly against those characterizations, okay? I am doing two things. I am a fairly straightforward, simple believer in our liberal democratic system. I don't put too many ifs or buts on it. And I think this, I mean, there's a sickness, there's a problem, there's a turbulence. So my feeling is, if you came to me and said, I feel terrible, and I told you I'm a doctor, by the way, I've taken some tests, you have double pneumonia. You wouldn't turn to me and say, well, you're a techno-pessimist. You would say, well, how do I get better? Now that we know what we got, how do I get better? So the book is my analysis of, okay, why are things seem to be so the times are so out of joint today? Why is there this turbulence? Is it just fictitious? Is it something we imagine because the noise is so much greater? Or is it real? And my take is that it's real. It's real at every level. I mean, if you look, for example, people feel like, but there's so many new things, and you just want to get used to the old devices, new devices come. And so is that just, did everybody always say that in every age? No. Again, that chart is very interesting. We are exposed to many, many more new things, which means many things we are used to doing become obsolete, which means we're now very uncomfortable about that sort of thing. So there is a lot of turbulence around that, and a lot of resistance probably as well. So we have to understand that the causes are, number one, a public that was basically silent for its entire history, and now that it's out, it's very angry, and it's very mutinous.
Was it always angry before?
We don't know.
Right.
Who
Can't
knows? Yeah, who knows? Who knows? Because they never spoke.
Right.
Now they're speaking, and they are angry.
Yeah.
And facing them, and they're networked because they are creatures of the digital environment, and then against them, and they're used to living that environment. So, for example, you can get a date in a nanosecond. Of course, I've been married for many, many decades, so I look at that and think, boy, that would have been nice way back when. You can buy a car in a nanosecond, but then you turn to those institutions that rule your life, the government. And it takes you hours to get a driver's license. It takes you weeks to get a passport, and it sometimes takes you years to get a building permit, okay? And it's this conflict between the digital world with its incredibly fast feedback loops. People who bought what you bought also bought this. Here's more things that are from people just like you. We want to please you. You turn to these institutions that are arranged on the industrial model that basically are telling you you are at the bottom of this hierarchy. The lowest person in this government hierarchy is higher than you are. And you now have to dance to our tune. And you're used to pushing a button and getting what you want, and you're hearing this. And you're seeing what's going on with these governmental entities. And in your perception, and I think to some extent empirically, you see a lot of failure. And you see a lot of people who seem to be benefiting from being the people that run these institutions. I mean, I live in the suburbs of Washington. Several of the wealthiest the municipalities, I guess you would call it, in the United States of America are in the suburbs of Washington. I was a bureaucrat. You do well as a bureaucrat, okay? People see that and they say, okay, but what do we get out of it? You seem to be failing again and again. And now we have this conflict between an elite class that seems very panicked, very clueless. If you're the elite, everything in your mind must come from the top down. So the elite class is eternally surprised by these big eruptions from below, like what happened with Trump, what happened with Sanders, what happens in the Arab Spring. That's not supposed to happen. The Arab Spring was a complete surprise to them. Brexit was a shock. And Trump, I mean, my feeling about that is that they haven't even come to terms with that. In some way, there is a resistance movement against the reality that there is such a thing as a President Trump.
So maybe that's an interesting thought to pause on as well, which is the bigger picture there being what happens when an angry public, let's say, turns into a crowd and then gets what it wants. What are they left with? Now what are they holding and what do they do?
Well, I think the deeper question there is what do they want?
What indeed?
What do they want? And, I talked about the public is really many. But I always felt like I could speak of the public as a thing because they share certain characteristics. Right, left, middle, all these little war bands, I've started calling them, because that seems to be what they've become. I mean, they were niche communities to begin with, but in our highly, I don't know what the word to use, sort of super energized, hyperactive moment in both social and political history, they've become like roaming war bands looking for things to yell about, and that sort of gives them away. One of the things they have in common is they don't have leaders. There's a tremendous egalitarian feeling. Anybody, and that comes from the web. I don't know how much you've seen this happen, but anybody who sticks their heads out in the web and says, I'm somebody, gets cut down to size within seconds, all right? And if there's anything in that person's past or anything that person has ever said that can be tracked to mock or humiliate or destroy them, that will be out online in seconds. So tends to be very egalitarian, tend to be very non-programmatic. They do not espouse program A. They do not, they're not for some very complicated government thing that should happen because they have a problem that needs a solution. And they are mostly non-ideological. I think there is an ideology that infuses each variation of the public. There is a Sanders kind of left public and a Trump kind of right public. But if you look at that, and you ask, what is it that brings these people together? Is that they're against. They're just against. They look at the established order, and they see these people who don't listen to them and exist at an enormous social distance. Politicians today live at an enormous social distance from the public. They're way up in the clouds. They talk differently than we do. They say things about things that most people are not interested in, but they feel is interesting,
Right.
So the things that the public happens to be interested in, they sometimes
Chats and pornography.
Well, yeah, there you go.
things.
There you go. Yeah, I mean, they basically that is the elite idea of the public. What are these people talking about? And then racism, or they're a bunch of crazy leftists who want to destroy capitalism. If you're on the other side, the public. The public has no real unifying principle. It has no organization that leads it. It has no programs that it has normally gathered about. I'm trying to think of any exceptions, and I can't think of any at the moment. It just finds these objects and people and institutions that it suddenly is very violently against. Okay, and you can be unified. I mean, if you look at the crowd in Tahrir Square in Egypt back in the Arab Spring of 2011, you would find extreme left secular socialists that were in that crowd. You would find mainstream, educated, kind of normal, everyday Egyptian youth that were on that crowd. You would find Muslim Brotherhood people, young people. The older people didn't support it, but the younger Muslim Brotherhood. And there were many varieties of each of those. So what happened was a Tahrir Square crowd, which was the public in action in that case, of course, it unified itself around the objective of overthrowing Mubarak. Now, the thing happened that you said, right? They got what they wanted. Mm-hmm. They overthrew Mubarak, and they disintegrated. They just fell apart. There was no cohesive principle. Most of them thought they were doing for democracy, but you had the Muslim Brotherhood who doesn't believe in that. Some were had a very progressive leftish idea of democracy. Some were far more restricted. I mean, it was not. They had nothing to gather about, and so they pushed Mubarak out and cleared the field for two top-down institutions: the Muslim Brotherhood that won the first presidency in Egypt, and then the army that knocked them out and took over in the end.
Where do these then? And I agree with your point. I mean, I completely agree with it that there's nothing that they want. There's no such thing as a, call it, political platform for a crowd.
Right.
Right? They just are against something. So where do these platforms come from? I mean, if people don't walk around with them in their head, then is it just nothing more than a fiction of the elites?
I mean, I that's a good question, and I the answer is probably who knows. But since we're talking about it, I'm just going to go ahead and plunge into speculation. All right.
How about it?
Yeah. So with those caveats, I think there is a tremendous sort of reservoir of anger in the public against the elites. And what you can never tell is where the tipping point, if you want to go back to Malcolm Gladwell, where the tipping point is going to hit. And I'm going to give you a very recent example. Emmanuel Macron got elected president of France in an almost revolt of the public sort of way. I mean, his party had basically been created less than a year before he got elected. He brought in a whole bunch of new people with him. He was not an establishment person totally. I mean, he belonged to that class by training and education, and he had been, I think, economics minister with the socialist government for like a year. So he wasn't completely out of nowhere the way that Trump was, but almost. But he chose what he said. He wanted to be a Jupiterian president.
Yeah.
He wanted to be lofty. He wanted to live in Olympus. And many Frenchmen felt very angry at that. They did not want an Olympian figure. I mean, he was imitating de Gaulle. That worked before the fifth wave. That does not work during the fifth wave. The problem is he had these encounters, these normal institutional encounters with, for example, labor unions that always tend to derail presidents in France who want to reform the economy. And he won. Everybody was astonished. What a successful man. And then he raised a few pennies the diesel tax. Well, I mean, there's a long history in that. But among other things, the entire French population had been pushed to diesel because it was supposed to be clean. Now they're saying, no, it's terrible. So now they're taxing it so they don't use it. There is a whole population in France that feels like they're taxed to death, and that their mobility, for example, they have the speed limits have been brought down, and they have tolls in the road that keep going up. So if you live in Paris, you're a happy guy. You live in a globalized world, and you're probably educated, and you are the equivalent of anybody, say, in New York or London. But if you live in the provinces, what they call the periphery of France, you are very angry. And it was just, you ask, well, what happens? Well, it was just that little 2 or 3 cents tax that ignited that yellow vest protest that pretty much has destroyed Emmanuel Macron as a political figure in Europe. I mean, so could you or could I have predicted that protest over, I mean, if you have given me 1,000 choices, it would have been not even one of them, okay? So there is a degree of unpredictability as to what is the trigger, the tipping point, and I would venture to say it is probably wholly unpredictable.
So is it the case then that what's changed about the society in the fifth wave is that it's just become easier for these crowds to develop?
Yeah, that is exactly right. This anger is not always crowd. Sometimes it's an online discussion. All right,
crowd in the abstract sense.
Yeah. I prefer to call them the public.
Okay.
But I mean, yeah, that's exactly right. It can happen at any moment. At any moment. I mean, if you read the book, in Israel, at a moment where the country was booming, and they had just had an election the year before, and Mr. Netanyahu had won handily with all his fairly, I would say, pro-business ideas. This one young woman who basically found that she couldn't afford her apartment in Tel Aviv anymore got angry and started a tent city in Rothschild Boulevard in Tel Aviv, which is a fancy district. And within weeks, there were 1 million people in the streets of Israel. I mean, Israel at that time had 8 or 9 million. This is like a gigantic proportion of the population. Netanyahu responded far more nimbly than that governments, the institutions tend to. The institutions tend to be completely they just stare in disbelief and have no idea what's going on until basically they get swept away, as happened, for example, in Spain with the ruling party there when the Indignados were doing the same thing. But basically, he was a pro-business guy, and a whole lot of not pro-business rules were imposed as a concession to these demonstrations. Why did it happen then? What triggered it? This one woman. I mean, so it is so easy and unpredictable that if I were, and thank goodness I'm not, a ruler of a country, I would stay awake at night. because you just don't know when the next eruption from below is going to happen. And if you have any savvy, and mostly they don't, but if you have any savvy, you know you're going to be the last to know, because all the instruments of knowledge that you have are very hierarchical and sort of industrial model, and all of this is happening way outside their ken.
And I think that one of the things that I learned reading your book, or thought about reading your book, was actually the way in which politicians themselves are evolving. So you're probably have the distinction of the first person I've ever seen who draws a similarity between Obama and Trump.
Yes.
In terms of how they manage actually the public.
Yes.
Maybe you ought to give us that analysis and surprise everybody and actually say they're very similar.
Yes. Well, I won't say they're similar. I mean, they're very different in almost every way.
Except.
But they were similar in the way that they managed. Right now, there is a kind of a Democrat's dilemma. People talk about the dictator's dilemma, and we could talk about that. It sort of came back to bite Mubarak in the butt. But there's also a Democrat's dilemma, and that is that to get elected to be president, you have to promise things that you cannot possibly deliver on. I mean, I'm a believer in I don't believe in conspiracy theories. I believe that these people sincerely think they can do the things that they say they intend to implement, and they always speak of our society in mathematical terms as problems that have a solution, rather than as an enormous number of interrelationships that are so tangled up that anything you pick up on one side is going to have a dozen or more unintended effects. So when these people are elected and they try to do the things that they have promised, as actually most of they try and do, it tends to backfire. As, for example, President Obama was elected and he put in the stimulus and he put in Obamacare. And in his first midterm elections, his governing majority was swept out. All right. The Tea Party arose. The Tea Party were one of the earlier revolts of the public. The Tea Party arose and swept out the Democratic majority in both houses of Congress. So Obama reacted by essentially becoming somebody who took the side of the angry public. If you look at the Obama rhetoric, it's very condemnatory. He condemns a lot. Presidents tended until that moment to say, "Isn't life wonderful? The United States of America, no greater country. Things are magnificent. Everything is just going wonderfully." Right. President Obama took the opposite tack. He, I think very sincerely, would say things like women's rights are under attack. He would say inequality, both political but particularly economic, is on the rise and it's stuck. There are no there's no social or economic mobility. And then he would stop. Normally, again, American presidents would say, "And here's my program to fix this. I am a solution to that problem." He stopped saying that once he lost his governing majority. And the problem is always help him get reelected because he became the voice of a public that was very angry about a lot of things and never went the next step, which was, like I said before, the public is very united against, but very divided about what to do about it. It's not like people don't have ideas about what to do. It's that there is no united public to do that. The second you start talking positive programs, the public fractures. And Obama knew enough to stop at that line. He said, "I think this is bad. I think that is bad. I think we should keep our eye on this." And he kind of saw his job, I think, as being kind of like a prophet in the wilderness, somebody who called out these injustices, which if he hadn't done so would be happening in the dark, right? And nobody would pay attention. And of course, Trump, I mean, I don't know what I can say about that. I think Trump has spent his entire time finding things to be against. His whole take on immigration, much of basically he was against Obama. Much as, by the way, Obama was against George W. Bush, but evolved beyond that. I think he is the recent people gathered around him. I mean, you think about the man, okay? And I say this about the book to anybody listening. If you can guess what I have political opinions, but if you can guess what they are from the book, I failed in some way, right? So as I'm talking right now, I'm not talking as a political advocate, but as a complete analyst, all right? And when you look at a person like Trump, and you look at the 2016 and the primary moment, and you ask yourself, well, what happened there? Well, This is a man who had zero government experience at any level. He didn't have political allies. He was or connections. He was ideologically formless. Okay, he had been for and against abortion in his day, for example. A person that innocent of qualifications and political direction gets elected for a very simple reason. The public saw him as a club in their hands with which to bash at the established order. He got elected precisely because, not in spite of, his seeming lack of qualifications. He is, I think, an effect, not a cause, of the revolt of the public.
Not dissimilar from Obama, right?
Not dissimilar
not
from
very
Obama.
experienced. I mean, experienced in some areas, but not in federal politics.
Right.
And Obama once famously said, "I'm like a mirror." I forget the words are exactly.
Yeah.
People hold up and they see what they want to see or see themselves, and so very similar. It's the politician of the 21st century.
I think we're stumbling our way to a new political mode. And these are the early versions of that. I think we may look back on them and think that they were kind of clumsy and awkward because they were themselves were figuring out how on earth you can, given this Democrats' dilemma, the dilemma of democracy, that you get elected promising what cannot possibly be implemented. How do you maintain your authority as an elected figure, number one? That tends to go away very soon. And, of course, they want to get reelected. So how does that happen? So I think they're just figuring this out. I think we got a long ways to go.
And the elites are freaking out, and they see, and this is a lot of what I've read, is that the elites often with a bit of a bias too, but they'll look at, say, a Trump and say, this is so dark, the rhetoric is so negative. And one of the things that I've learned talking to you just now and reading your book is that it's possible that always was what the public wanted. But now they're just actually being a bit better about implementing it. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, this is my take on that is I am astounded. I'm kind of astounded by the reaction of the elites. I mean, I feel, by the way, that every modern society has to have an elite class of some kind. Now, the steepness of the pyramid is up for debate, I think, and I think it's probably way, way too steep. But I mean, this is. I can't perform heart surgery. I probably shouldn't be president of the United States, and so there have to be people who are qualified to do these things, who at least get allocated the job of doing it in some way or another. But so that's to begin with. I'm not anti-elite necessarily on principle, but in the olden days in CIA, we were fighting communism in those days. We studied the bad guys, right? We tried to see them as they saw themselves. Try to understand what made them tick. There has been such an absolute lack of attempts to understand what brought Trump to the presidency. Such an absolute lack. It to me, astonishing. It is, if you want to, and by the way, if you go to Britain, it's the same thing with Brexit. If you go to France, it's the same thing with the yellow jackets, the yellow vests. You go to Germany, it's the same thing with the Alternative for Germany party. The elites feel that these are people who have no legitimacy in the public sphere. They should be shut up somehow. And
very Lippmann-esque.
And with Trump, of course, there is a sense that explanation via conspiracy theory. You know, the Russians and Facebook and this and that and the other, that are transparently. I mean, if you analyze the data, transparently bogus. These are just screams of anguish. You know, intellectual screams of anguish by people who think democracy has died in darkness because such a creature as Trump has been elected, and they should perhaps stand back from it and say, well, why? Why does such a person with such few qualifications get to be elected president of the United States? I mean, I hope the book provides a few answers. But it is, to me, when I talk to those people, I feel like I'm talking in Sanskrit sometimes. Because they just kind of look at me like, what are you talking about? I mean, they're not interested. There is no interest in understanding the thing that they're opposing. And without taking sides, whether they're right or wrong, or Trump is right or wrong, and I think actually my analytic opinion is that they're both in some sense right and both in some sense very wrong. Trump has the advantage that he knows the elite. He's one of them. He's been moving in that.
Absolutely.
He's been swimming in that pond for his whole life.
Yeah.
Whereas the elites have no clue. They just have no clue what this thing is that he is, or the people behind them, right? And they don't want to have a clue. They want him to go away. And I feel like that's not good for democracy, because it kind of takes the half of the country that voted for Trump and sort of marginalizes them in some ways. Instead of trying to understand, even if you disagree, which you obviously will, trying to understand the motives. The motives are always dark. So you have Washington Post, the second Trump got elected, changed his motto. Democracy dies in darkness, okay? Well, I mean, it hasn't died yet. This is just another moment in this very turbulent era that we're living through. Let's understand it. And let's save the pieces of our democracy that are worth saving. And maybe there are some others that, like, for example, those enormous pyramids, the fact that there seems to be, once somebody gets elected to the federal government, there's almost no difference between them and, say, a Hollywood star, not only in terms of how distant they are from ordinary people, but, by God, their sexual behavior,
Sure. People, the thing that really appeals to me about the whole line of thought is that, if I think to myself in real life, right, where there's such a natural inclination for people, myself included, to maybe it's like, you can call it an egalitarian impulse, where you want to kind of bring down the people you don't know to your level, right? And you think about the celebrity magazines, it's about pictures of them in unflattering positions, and they're getting the swimsuit and whatever, and I think that there's something deep about that idea, and then now is maybe just getting broadcast more widely through social media.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of that. I think part of what happens is our heroes all the warts are out there now, and with this enormous tsunami of information, everybody, and honestly, the public, for whatever reasons, and that I haven't, I won't even go into it, but tends to look at the warts and just want to deal with that. And in our democracy, okay,
makes them feel good. Hey, the big fancy person. Oh yeah, they screwed up too, and I feel better about myself. I want more of that.
But that's true. That's true. We have a word for that. It's called envy, and it's not a pretty thing. And
sure.
I think
Schadenfreude.
Yeah, right. I think there's almost too much.
I'm not saying it's good. I'm just saying it's always been there and will always be there.
No question. But it goes deeper than that again, because people have this idea that we're living through a very terrible time, and that's universal, by the way. That everybody seems to think that. And I look around me. I mean, I've come to New York City, as I do very frequently, and every time I come, half of it has been torn down and rebuilt. So it's always under construction. My city of Washington D.C., I live in the Virginia suburbs, is even more that way. Okay, but I have traveled beyond that. And yes, there are other places that are less prosperous, but the United States of America is doing pretty well, it seems to me, at almost every level. Not perfect. There are things you can point are not working as well as it could be and so forth, but you think about the Great Depression, you think about World War II and the fact that the totalitarians came within an ace of conquering the world. You think about the Cold War and the fact we could have devastated each other with nuclear weapons at any moment, and almost did a couple of times. And you think about now, and you go, okay, yeah, I get it. You're unhappy because a lot of social and political warts, I guess I would call them, are visible to you that weren't visible before. But I think we should have a sense of proportion about this as well.
Mm-hmm. What about the theory that actually the unhappiness is, and this is something that you allude to in your book, if not discussed explicitly for a moment, really that we're actually, because we're in good shape, we're complaining a little bit more. So here's something that I don't think you discuss, but it's an idea that I think about sometimes, is that actually World War II, although horrific in all kinds of ways, produced a society following it that was pretty egalitarian, pretty institutionally supportive. People, the social club membership went up, right? People were there's more camaraderie, there's more cohesion. Let's call it social cohesion. And that was a result of having gone. We've all seen what that's like. Let's do a little kumbaya. Thanks very much. A couple of generations later, and nobody remembers that anymore. And so now let's just fight it out in the street.
Yeah, well, we're not fighting it out on the street. I mean,
online.
Right. I mean,
metaphorically.
Yes. Well, nowadays you have to distinguish that because I mean, in Paris they are fighting out on the streets. So we are not like that, and yet we are just as grumpy and grouchy as our French counterparts. So, that is. I think to turn it all around, I think what we have is a terrible crisis of authority. I think part of what you say is true. There's Schadenfreude and there is envy, but I think also people want to admire those who have risen above them. All right, this is not a thing that Americans should find bizarre. Okay, for many years, George Washington, including in his lifetime, by the way, everybody said he's the model we all aspire to. I mean, we'll never get there because he had such integrity to his character, but this is the man. I mean, they basically wrote the presidency into the Constitution knowing that he was going to be the first one, and so we're safe. It's going to happen. Or later on, you could say Thomas Edison. But man, I mean, I was told when I was a kid, the filaments to invent the light bulb. There were, I don't know how many hundreds or dozens or whatever filaments that he went through. Persistence. Yeah. He was not just an inventor. He was
99% perspiration.
He had a certain kind of persistent character. Yes. And although we weren't inventors, we could share in that attribute and we could admire it. Yeah. Okay? If you ever want to see two very different takes on two very similar people, you compare 1940 or so movie called Young Edison, I think it's called, or something like that, with Social Network. I mean, and you take two very different approaches as to what a young, cranky, eccentric, and
brilliant,
and world-changing in some ways inventor, who they are.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a crisis of authority, and I think we want as much to have faith and admiration for the people who are among the elites as we have envy of them. I think both things are at least equally strong. And my belief is, in the end, there is an interaction between elites and the public that you get to choose your elites to some degree. There really is a Democrat's dilemma. If you vote for somebody who says, I'm going to solve your problems, then when that problem fails, you deserve it. Because you should know, read my book, you should know that he should never have said that. He really did not know. Even if he intended it, as I think most of them do, sincerely. Of course, it never gets interpreted that way. Everybody says they lied, and conspiracy theories immediately kick in when failure happens. But even if he meant it sincerely, or she meant it sincerely, the fact is, you should never vote for somebody who promises to solve your problems, because human interactions are not mathematical problems. They are very complex, and they're very difficult to get around. So it's a question of a certain amount of modesty in our leadership, a certain amount of integrity in our leadership, and courage to say things that are basically, I'm not a divinity that can just wave a wand and make healthcare become magnificent and free. It can't happen. There are no solutions. There are programs, and you can test them, and you can do trial and error, and when they fail, I mean, I will vote for the first politicians who says, no, I was wrong. I thought this program was going to go this way, but I'm looking at the data, and I think we need to change it in this direction. The first one that says, I'm wrong, that man's got my vote.
Well, on a similar note, and we're running out of time, so just one last question, which is, you quite carefully and gingerly suggest a possible recommendation, let's say, to how we manage our government institutions. Careful to caveat that, but let us know what you think it is that can be done. It could be done by the government.
Right. I am very careful because although I think I'm a very good analyst and I think I provide a good framework description for what is ailing our times politically and socially, I'm not sure why anybody should listen to anything I've got to say other than the people who already agree with me, right? But I'll give one example of where the revolt of the public is leading and where we ought to start thinking differently, and we do. We are, after maybe since the post-war period that you mentioned, an enormous amount of integration, and everything had to be, the more you could bring together into a regional or global umbrella, the more of a moral clout you had. So you had the economy run by the World Bank to some extent, and you had the European countries becoming the EU, and so everything was coalescing and integrating, and then that has now gone into reverse. That has gone into severe reverse. Things are, and it's not a new thing. It probably started way back when with the Soviet Union, but only now has that become apparent to me, at least. I think our divisions are such, we're very fractured. We're very divided. And I think the old industrial model believed in one size fits all. And that's the problem solution model, right? We have a gigantic problem and I've got a gigantic solution. And when you do that, at least half of the people are going to feel oppressed or feel they don't want it. So to the degree that you decentralize government, to the degree that you allow local and state authorities to make decisions so that it's closer to what the people on the ground wants. In the U.S., that would match, I think, our political demographic, because people tend to be concentrated in areas. The red states and the blue states, except for a handful, like my Virginia, which is sort of purple, I think trending blue. You would then get solutions, if that's the word you want to. I don't like that word. So you would get programs that are of the kind that are amenable to you. The Californians would get something very state-driven, something very top-down, something very industrial, and maybe the Texans would get something bottom-up, something very open up opportunity, and we'd have competition, and everybody would be, I think, a little less outraged all the time at the federal government.
Mm-hmm. My guest today is Martin Gurri. His latest book is The Revolt of the Republic. Martin, thanks for joining me.
Thank you.